The mandate consists of the privatisation of the former agricultural and forestry land owned by the GDR, which was transferred to the federal government after reunification. We lease the land until we have identified the land's parcels for sale, which will then be sold in order to implement the ultimate goal of privatisation. Our mandate is enshrined in the laws that were passed for this purpose by the German Bundestag after reunification. The advantage with regard to reunification was that an agricultural structure existed in the former Federal Republic, which then also served as a model for what was to be achieved in the new federal states. This is a conventional farm that mainly produces grain, sugar beet and energy maize. We have 2 permanent employees. At harvest times we also hire harvest workers. This farm here is a historic family farm that was returned to us in 1991. Farming in the past during my father's lifetime, whether that was in the old federal states after our escape or here, of course, had a completely different dimension, a different structure, a completely different size. Small-scale farming dominated. I still know it myself to plough with a horse. The machines had a maximum 30 PS. Ploughing was a completely different story back then. Farming always included livestock, 15 to 16 cows, hard work. Farming was carried out under difficult conditions. I was entitled to restitution because this farm was expropriated in 1949. My parents had to leave this farm with 4 children overnight because my father was about to be imprisoned for allegedly sabotaging public property. It was also the time when many farmers fled what was then the GDR in the 1950s. I got back the entire farm with over 97 hectares in total, which included 80 hectares of arable land, 9 hectares of grassland and the farmstead with the surrounding area. After the federal government had examined the restitution claim and the negotiations had been concluded, it was immediately mine. In other words, the property was immediately entered in the land register. The return of this farm was not subject to any further requirements. It was returned unconditionally. And the main goals at the beginning were certainly securing the land in our portfolio, ensuring its cultivation by making appropriate lease agreements on a large scale so that things could continue without interruptions. And then the next aim was to identify persons with legitimate claims so that they get access to the land they were entitled to. This farmstead was very problematic. It was in a very bad state, very desolate condition. When I started here, all of this felt unfamiliar, so I first had to find my way around. When I arrived here, I was welcomed with open arms by the elderly. Of the younger ones, there was less benevolence.
Weniger Wohlwollen.
The peculiarity was that, of course, former owners now again looked at their old property in the east. And the second large group that had to be considered was, of course, those who had farmed in the GDR. Members of the agricultural production cooperatives, who, of course, after 40 years of management, also had ideas of how they wanted to continue in the new system, in the system of the Federal Republic of Germany. To regulate by law who has what entitlement to which area and how to balance it out, that was a legislative challenge. And of course, it was also a challenge in terms of implementation.
Das ist dann aber natürlich auch in der Umsetzung eine Herausforderung.
Ja, das war eine spannende Zeit.
Yes, that was an exciting time. We knew which areas of land belonged to us and were to be managed by us by law. But we neither knew where they were nor in what condition they were. Although we had a first legal framework, there were still no regulations on how the land was to be managed and privatized, and of course, we also had no staff.
Natürlich auch kein Personal. Also wie baut man sowas auf? Man sucht sich Mitarbeiter.
So how do you build up something like that? You first look for employees who have a bit of an understanding of agriculture, who are also academically qualified if possible, and who have thus been able to grow with these challenges. So we started with a lot of young employees and trained them ourselves. We searched for land parcels ourselves and outlined them with pens on paper maps. That's how it started.
Und mit Stiften Flächen umrandet. So hat das angefangen. Es war uns bewusst auch, dass wir Fehler gemacht haben.
We were aware that we made mistakes during the early stages. There was no other way. However, over the years we got better and better. Finally, we got an IT system. We grew from 10 employees in Saxony-Anhalt to over 130 employees in the heyday. Today we are only 50. We have grown with our tasks and the amount of tasks and have become smaller again.
Aufgaben und der Aufgabenmenge gewachsen und wieder kleiner geworden. Die Politik war noch am Diskutieren, wie soll es denn weitergehen.
Politicians were still discussing how to proceed. Therefore, we started by concluding short-term lease agreements so that the farmers who cultivated these areas had a basis.
Wir haben nicht gewartet, bis wir alle Informationen hatten.
We didn't wait until we had gathered all required information. Then, over the years, farmers also needed a basis for their own investments. Therefore, land then had to be leased on a long-term basis, which in our case was 12 years.
In unserem Fall 12 Jahre sind. Hinzu kam natürlich den Verkauf für
We also started to sell land for infrastructure, for the construction of motorways, for the settlement of industry and residential developments. That has been a crucial factor in driving economic development. We then made lease recommendations together with the regional agricultural officers and federal state authorities as to who should lease which areas. In the end, from today's perspective, it was a somewhat non-transparent solution, but exactly the right one for the time. The general aim was to promote sustainable agriculture and contribute to rural development.
Möglichst nachhaltige Landwirtschaft zu betreiben zur Entwicklung des ländlichen Raums.
Für mich war damit die Existenz gesichert durch diese
These lease contracts with BVVG secured the viability of our farm. Purchasing the land would not have been possible for us back then. These 205 hectares then, of course, had a significant positive effect on the operating result for my farm at the time.
Effekt für das Betriebsergebnis. Es gab 91 die
In
Förderungsmöglichkeit.
1991, there was the possibility of funding via a public loan of more than 250,000 D-marks. This public loan only included 1% interest, and we received a grant of 20,000 D-marks. These funding opportunities we used for our farm.
Das waren die Fördermöglichkeiten, die
This had to finance the working capital until the harvest and had to get the buildings and the main parts of the building in good condition.
musste die Gebäude
Overall, the 250,000 D-mark were largely used for the hall behind me.
wurden zu großen Teilen für die Halle hinter mir benutzt.
Der Produktionsfaktor Boden ist relativ teuer. Deswegen
Land as a production factor is relatively expensive. Therefore, it was right to sell part of the land to existing as well as to newly established agricultural companies without haste and at a subsidized price as part of the land purchase program.
dieses Flächenerwerbsprogramms.
This meant that the farmers had to have a sustainable business concept, that they had to commit to managing the farm themselves, and that a 20-year sales ban was imposed on the purchased land.
Weiterverkaufsverbot von 20 Jahren gab.
I think this is a very important point for stabilization because the aim was to set up sustainable farms and not to sell the land as an object of speculation that could be quickly resold.
Boden als Spekulationsobjekt zu verkaufen, damit es schnell weiterverkauft werden darf.
From these 200 hectares I purchased land in the course of time. For me, of course, this also meant a considerable consolidation of the farm through land ownership. Property consolidates, not lease.
Das Regelverfahren im Moment bei uns ist
If the
die
Federal
Ausschreibung
Republic sells a piece of land to which eligible parties do not have any legal claims, then the standard awarding procedure is a public tender, and the highest bidder will usually be able to purchase it. We have acquired smaller land areas on a small scale at market value. That wasn't a problem back then. With purchase costs of 15 to 20,000 euros per hectare, that's not an issue. You can earn that in the foreseeable future. But to pay double the price and then work on it for decades to amortize that, I don't see any point in it, because in the end I have to generate everything from my income.
Über mein Einkommen erwirtschaften.
Das ist zwischen Bund und Ländern vereinbart worden, dass
The federal government and the federal states had agreed that a third of the land that we lease or sell should first be made accessible only to certain target groups. This particularly concerns land areas that are intended for organic production, but also land areas for livestock farms that have a special need for land, including land areas for special crops, for example, growing vegetables. And in order to promote this, there are these so-called restricted tenders, where farmers with these types of production stay among themselves, meet only limited competition, and are therefore more likely to get access to the land.
und nur auf eine begrenzte Konkurrenz treffen.
Since recently, this has also included young farmers, because, of course, one also wants to promote a rejuvenation of the management, a change of generation and business startups.
Der Betriebsführung, einen Generationenübergang und eine Existenzgründung fördern will.
Ich möchte sagen, dass den Betrieb so aufzubauen.
I would like to note that setting up the farm in this way with this share of land ownership normally is a three-generation task to manage it and develop it that way and to have it paid for it all. As a rule, that would not be possible.
Das ist im Regelfall.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank my wife, who has been an essential pillar and who has supported everything here from the early years until today. Of course, it is also a great advantage for me as well as for many others, the enormous added value in which I am, of course, inevitably not involved. But when I see that I bought the square meter for 35 cents and today it costs €5 or more, of course 100% ownership share would be a dream come true, something everyone wishes for. Me too, of course, but it's unrealistic. With ownership of 40% or more, that's also very interesting and for me a great deal of security.
Und für mich auch eine große Sicherheit.
We tried to be transparent and to have an open dialogue with the farmers. The good thing was, and still is, that all the decisions that we make can be checked by politics and government bodies such as the Federal Audit Office or hearings in Parliament.
Wie zum Beispiel auch dem Bundesrechnungshof oder auch durch Anhörungen im Parlament.
Man wollte schon dafür sorgen, dass die örtlichen Betriebe...
One wanted to ensure that the local farms which shape the agricultural structure essentially get the opportunity to bring their ownership quota to a stable level in order to secure the long-term viability of their farm.
Deswegen ist die Verpachtung in der Regel...
So leasing is usually the intermediate step because it has been recognized that family farm-based entrepreneurial agriculture is the right model for the Federal Republic of Germany to stabilize the agricultural structure. And that is why it was said that we don't want to sell the land all at once in a certain predetermined period of time and as quickly as possible, but rather use privatization to stabilize the agricultural structure and thus also the structure in rural areas.
Und damit auch die Struktur in den ländlichen Räumen zu stabilisieren.
There was a basic political consensus regarding the legal framework. Guidelines existed and still exist, but politics does not interfere in day-to-day business. I think that is one of the great success factors. What could we have done better? I think we sold a little too quickly in some cases, and especially outside of the land purchase program, we allowed that sometimes properties were resold. And this has in some cases resulted in a concentration of land and an agricultural structure that one wanted to avoid policy-wise. Ultimately, I think the approach was absolutely correct. First stabilization through leasing and then slow privatization. A sensible and sustainable privatization, organized in the interests of regional development, takes longer than some promise and others hope for.
Versprechen und andere sich erhoffen.